Dr. Gay, you've been on the University of South Dakota campus here for the last couple of days talking about culturally responsive teaching. In one of your conversations, you talked about culturally responsive teaching and how it's evolved from where it started. Could you kind of talk a little bit more about where you see culturally responsive teaching now as culturally responsive teaching now than what it was before?
I think the idea has evolved in several ways, several directions even. I think initially, cultural responsive teaching tended to be located in, I would say, high school education for the most part, or that age group. And one of the ways in which it has evolved is to extend both downward in the education sequence and also upward. So you have more and more people now talking about culturally responsive teaching, if you will, across the spectrum of education, including young children, elementary school, and also increasingly people are beginning to talk about culturally responsive teaching or cultural responsiveness in university and college level as well. Even myself, I've never taught young children, like 4, 5, 6-year-olds.
Sure.
But more recently, I would say in the last 2 years, I've become increasingly interested in dealing with that and thinking about that age group. So that's one sort of evolution. And my guess is that progression is going to grow. So that's one. Another area where the evolving expansion, if you will, of cultural responsive teaching is evident is it's crossed the national boundaries now. So you can go to almost any country in the world of any size or significance, whatever you mean by that, and certainly on every continent in the world, and you'll have somebody in some context, some country, talking about cultural responsive teaching or multicultural education.
Sure.
The two things are not mutually exclusive, but that's the cultural responsiveness is the latest sort of vogue variation of that.
Sure.
So that's one another area. We also see more expansion of the of giving explicit attention to a wider variety of diversities, if you will. Initially, because of who people were leading the charge in this, it was very often African Americans got more of the play of the targeted group that needed these kind of interventions.
Right.
That's not to say that that group has not been attended to adequately or being excluded, but other, especially groups of color, you're hearing more and more. And people within the field are demanding that we not stop with just one ethnic group and say we have done it, but we have got to attend to these issues that cultural responsive teaching is about in different kind of cultural and community and group filters and all of that. So that's a third area. The fourth area that I see that is very exciting, I'm not quite sure what to do with that excitement yet, and that is that cultural responsiveness has extended beyond the boundaries of education as we know it. Education like K-12 education or in teacher education and all of that. So it's now in other professional fields. Social work is doing a lot in cultural responsiveness. Business is talking about whatever their language is, but it's equivalent of how do we serve different populations and distribute services and products more effectively to different potential consumers and all of that. Medicine and other healthcare industries are talking about how do you do those kind of services much more effectively to different kind of populations. Right. So I think that in some ways it's almost as if the growth has been such that it's surrounding the comprehensive domain of human life. Right. You know, rather than just the educative kind of person or the economic kind of thing or the psychological, that it's not either or of those, but the notion is that cultural responsiveness has to be addressed on these multiple levels.
Sure.
So it adds to the complexity, but I think it also adds, that kind of extension adds to the greater possibility of the transformation potential of this intervention.
So as we think about cultural responsiveness, and people often ask, what is cultural responsiveness? So what is cultural responsive teaching, or what is cultural responsive education?
Probably kind of maybe the oversimplistic way to say it is that it's the idea of using the cultural heritages, their legacies, the experiences, the points of references, but using, if you will, culture to of various ethnic and I would say ethnic and social groups, racial groups, as a resource to help us serve their needs much more effectively, and particularly serve the needs of those populations in such a way, whether it's in education or healthcare, that the population don't feel that they have got to compromise their cultural identity and their cultural socialization to have access to these other opportunities.
Sure. All right, so one of the things you talked about, I thought it was very fascinating. You talked about the different types of research that's happening that really is moving cultural responsive education in a different area as well. You've talked a lot about how researchers tend to look at their own ethnic group as they talked about cultural responsiveness, and now you're starting to see ethnic groups starting to look at other ethnic groups, other minority groups looking at minority groups, looking at hopefully that some minority groups can look at non-minority groups as it relates to cultural responsiveness. If we were to engage in that kind of research, what are the possibilities? What are the impacts? And how do you think that would really add to cultural responsive education?
Well, I think it will probably, certainly it will give the application or the pedagogical part of cultural responsiveness a greater ground and a greater range of what are domains or what are issues or aspects of human life and living that the educative process need to attend to. So that would be helpful. But I think that will happen is cultural responsiveness is anchored on the notion of knowing, of being rather deeply grounded in cultural knowledge. Mm-hmm. So the research from the perspective of and experiences of different ethnic groups about different ethnic groups are likely to produce more authentic information and database about culture. Sure. And how to understand, how to see, how to view, how to understand culture without it being filtered through somebody else's frame of reference. Sure. Because one of the problems with research in the past is that's done about minority groups by non-minority people is that research has been exploitive. Sure. It's been prejudicial because you find some human behavior, and then the researchers have interpreted that human behavior through. Of course, we have to interpret the human behavior, but that has been done through their own cultural filters. Sure. And when that behavior doesn't fit the filters, it's very often been read as being hegemonic and exploitive and discriminatory. So. Cultural responsive research, whether it's done from the insider perspective or it's done by researchers from ethnic groups or across ethnic group, has the possibility of generating a less prejudicial base of knowledge, a much more, if you will, culturally authentic insights. Sure. And then if we can get better culturally authentic insights and we develop practices based on that, we ought to have better practices. Sure. Yeah. At least that's the logic.
Yes, of course, sure. So, where do we go from here? Where do you see the field going from here? The field of cultural responsive education.
Well, there are a number of different possibilities. A potential danger is it could be just a passing fad or a vogue. Sure. And unfortunately, in education in the United States, historically tends to be very voguish. Mm-hmm. So something comes along, it sounds like a great thing, it's hot, everybody's talking about it, and that lasts for a minute. That's the fashionable thing to do. Fashion goes out of vogue. So that's one thing. But I'm encouraged by the fact is that educators, school people, those kind of educators, are no longer the only ones advocating for this, but there are parallel kinds of movements by other disciplines. And that might be the thing that causes us to prevail even more. Because if for no other reason, if lawyers begin to talk about cultural responsiveness and medical profession, doctors start talking about cultural responsiveness, those are higher status professions in education. Sure. So what they're doing may have some rollover effects for education and might give us some momentum, it might give us some reinforcement, revalidation. It's unfortunate that has to happen, but that has been the case. So we may get much more leverage on that. The other thing is that because cultural responsiveness is going in multiple directions now, and not all of those targeted populations and needs are in the same place, that might cause it to prevail even longer than it might otherwise. So I'm optimistic.
Sure.
And maybe I'm optimistic because when all this is said and done, however way we serve human beings, since humans are cultural beings,
sure.
we should be alert to the cultural parameters that surround the human being and not try to bypass those in whatever service we want to deliver, but we send those services through those surrounding filters.
Right.
If we are willing to accept that, then it should be permanent. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Gay, thank you very much. It's
You're
always
quite
an honor.
welcome. Yeah.
Thank you.